Okay, important messages. 2-2 overtime. Belgium and Japan. Tough life. Anyway, we will continue our presentations this afternoon. And I have with me Manuel Caballero, who's our Officer Market-Based Measures. Manuel, go for it. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jane, and good afternoon, all. I hope you had a nice coffee break. Thank you again to Bombardier for sponsoring it. We are now heading into the last presentation of this first day of the seminar, where we are going to cover the R and V parts of the MRV system. We are going to talk about the reporting and verification of CO2 emissions. So I would like to start with a reminder of what we saw in the presentation before lunch. We know by now that an MRV system is a key component of CORSIA, and it's key to the success of CORSIA implementation. We need to start implementing the MRV system from 1st of January 2019 because already in 2019 operators will need to monitor CO2 emissions from all international flights in order to determine the so-called CORSIA baseline for which data from years 2019 and 2020 will be used. So we know by now that the components of the MRV system are firstly the monitoring of the fuel use from international flights and the related CO2 emissions. We have seen in the presentation before lunchtime how those CO2 emissions are calculated. We have the reporting of CO2 emissions information between airplane operators, states, and ICAO. And last but not least, we have the verification of the reported emissions in order to ensure the completeness and robustness of the information provided. So if we take as a reference the adopted Annex 16 Volume 4, the CORSIA SARPs, we know that we cover the MRV provisions in Part 2, Chapter 2 of the SARPs. In the presentation before lunchtime, we have seen what is related to the applicability of MRV requirements and the monitoring of CO2 emissions. What we are going to see in this last presentation this afternoon is the reporting and verification of CO2 emissions, as well as data gaps and error corrections to emissions report. So let's start with the first part of this presentation on the reporting of CO2 emissions. Throughout the presentation, we are going to display this slide a few times just to show that when it comes to the reporting of CO2 emissions under CORSIA, we have 3 reporting lines with 3 stakeholders: operators, states, and ICAO. So we are going to go one by one to see when one of these stakeholders have to report, what they have to report, and to whom they have to report. So let's start with the first reporting line from the operator to state. When it comes to CO2 emissions, the basic document that is going to be used by operators to report to states is the aeroplane operator's emissions report. So CORSIA, we already know that CORSIA requires aeroplane operators conducting international flights to report on CO2 emissions related to those flights. Here, in this slide, we try to summarize key information on this first reporting line. The first time operators will have to submit their emissions report to the states will be 2020. We have seen before that the collection of fuel use data and related CO2 emissions data starts in 2019. Operators need some time to consolidate that information before submitting it to the states. So the first reporting year will be 2020 for data related to 2019 international flights. The emissions report will have to be submitted by operators to states on an annual basis. This is an important difference between the two documents that we have considered so far. The emissions monitoring plan is a sort of framework document, but we have also seen that it is a live document. When operators see that there are significant changes to that framework, they will engage with their state and update the emissions monitoring plan. But there is not, let's say, a given timeline for that update of the emissions monitoring plan. However, operators know that they will have to submit their emissions report every year starting in 2020. The reporting format will be that of the emissions report, and after this presentation we will have a walk through the template of how an emissions report would look like. And as we have seen, the recipient of the emissions report will be the state to which the operator is attributed. So when drafting the emissions report, the aeroplane operator will take as a reference the emissions monitoring plan that has been submitted to and approved by the state to which the operator is attributed. So as we said, the emissions monitoring plan provides the framework, the how-to for the operator to report on CO2 emissions from 2020 onwards. So the emissions report, the annual emissions report, is the key document for the MRV system, taking into account that it will be the document that compiles all the information that is needed for CORSIA to function. And the details on which information has to be included in the emissions report is included in the Appendix 5 of the adopted Annex 16, Volume 4. What we are going to do in the next 4 slides is to go through a very brief description of the contents of the aeroplane operator's emissions report. So, of course, the operator will have to start by providing its information to identify the operator. It will also have to specify the reporting year. So as we said, the first emissions report will be submitted in 2020. The reporting year for that report will be 2019, because that report will refer to the emissions, CO2 emissions from flights that have been performed in 2019. And the emissions report will also include reference to the version of the emissions monitoring plan, which serves as the basis for the emissions report. So, as we said, once the emissions monitoring plan of an operator is approved by a state, there may be subsequent modifications that will lead to new versions of that emissions monitoring plan. And the emissions report will need to refer to the version of the emissions monitoring plan which is in place at the time of reporting. The emissions report will also have to include the list of operators' aeroplane fleet. That will apply to all aeroplanes with a maximum certificate takeoff mass greater than 5,700 kilograms, operating international flights during the reporting year. Here, the operator will also have to include leased aeroplanes. The operator will have to specify if they have used CERT, and of course, the operator will be able to do that if the operator is eligible. And we have seen the conditions of eligibility in the presentation we saw this morning. The operator will also provide information on the total fuel mass per type of fuel. Of course, when using CERT, as we have seen in the previous presentation, this data is not reported because the CERT output is directly CO2 emissions. There is no output related to fuel use. The operator will also have to provide details on the number of international flights during the reporting period. So he will provide one figure, the total number of operators' international flights during that period. And the operator will also provide a breakdown per state pair or per aerodrome pair. So when it comes to emissions report, these are two options that are provided. Obviously, reporting by state pair has less level of detail than if the reporting takes place by aerodrome pair. Both options are possible. What is important is that the state, at the time of discussion with the operator regarding the emissions monitoring plan, clearly specifies which of these two options the operator will have to follow. Last, but obviously not least, because this is the core of the emissions report, the report will include the information on the CO2 emissions during the reporting year. So we will have one value of total CO2 emissions from the reported flights. But in addition, there will be a breakdown either by state pair or by aerodrome pair, depending on the decision that has been made regarding which of these two options have to be followed. From the start of CORSIA's pilot phase, meaning from 2021, the reporting will also have to include subtotals referring to the flights that are subject to offsetting requirements. So that will be one figure, and then a second subtotal related to the flights which are not subject to offsetting requirements. Obviously, this is not something that can be reported during the 2019-2020 period because, by definition, there are no flights subject to offsetting requirements during those 2 years. Last but not least, the emissions report will also include basic information related to the verification body that has verified the emissions report. So this will be the basis of the reporting line on CO2 emissions from the operators to the state. But now in the next few slides, we are going to see what operators have to do in order to report on CORSIA eligible fuels. The adopted Annex 16 Volume 4 established that from the start of CORSIA's pilot phase, so from 2021, aeroplane operator can claim emissions reductions from the use of CORSIA eligible fuels. So in order to do that, operators can follow two options. They can either provide this information on an annual basis. So in a given year, when reporting to the state, they can claim emissions reductions from the use of a given amount of CORSIA eligible fuels. Another option is that the information for a given compliance period, and we have seen this morning that CORSIA works with 3-year compliance periods. So for a given compliance period, information on CORSIA eligible fuels is consolidated and provided once during that period. Taking into account that claiming emissions reductions from CORSIA eligible fuels is based on documentary proof related to the purchase of such fuel, obviously operators will not claim emissions reductions from fuels that have been purchased, but then after that have been sold to a third party in order to avoid double counting. So the operator that wants to claim emissions reductions from the use of CORSIA eligible fuels will need to include certain information on this in their annual emissions report. So for each of the CORSIA eligible fuel type, they will have to specify the mass of that type of fuel, the approved life cycle emissions values assigned to that fuel, and the emissions reductions claim. Of course, if they are going to report on more than one type of CORSIA eligible fuel, then at the end they will have to consolidate the total emissions reductions claim from the different types of CORSIA eligible fuels. In addition to what is reported in the operator's emissions report, the adopted Annex 16 Volume 4 requests those operators who claim emissions reductions from the use of CORSIA eligible fuels to provide information additional to that which is shown in the emissions report. So this additional information will consist of different checks and documentary evidence that can be provided at several levels. It can be provided from the producer of the CORSIA eligible fuel. It can also be provided by a fuel blender, but in the event of the operator purchasing the fuel from a supplier who is downstream the fuel blender, then this supplier will also need to provide some information in order to easily track the type of fuel and the amount of fuel that is the basis for the emissions reductions claim. It is important that, as it happens with regard to the emissions monitoring plan, there are also going to be reporting templates that are going to be made for both the emissions report and the additional information that has to be provided on CORSIA eligible fuels. This is going to be appended to the environmental technical manual related to Annex 16 Volume 4, but the templates in usable format, Excel file probably, will also be shared and posted in the ICAO CORSIA website. So now that we have concluded this first reporting line on CO2 emissions from operators to states, we are going to focus on the second reporting line from states to ICAO and see how this is going to work. We start with a summary slide similar to the one we used for the emissions report and which has many similarities with that of the emissions report. CORSIA requires states that have aeroplane operators performing international flights to relate it on CO2 emissions information stemming from the operations of the aeroplane operators. Again, the first reporting year will be 2020. As we saw before, operators are going to monitor fuel use and related CO2 emissions during 2019. They are going to need some time to consolidate that information during 2020, and they will submit that information to the state in 2020. The state will have to consolidate the information coming from the different operators attributed to the state and submit that information to ICAO also in 2020. Again, the frequency of this reporting will be on an annual basis, and in this case, the recipient will be ICAO. So, Appendix 5, Table A5/4 from Annex 16, Volume 4, show the minimum level of information that the state reporting to ICAO has to contain. So, first, it will include information, and here it is important that we need to make a distinction between how states are going to report on CO2 emissions in 2019-2020 and how they are going to do it from 2021. In 2019-2020, states are going to provide a total value of annual CO2 emissions per state pair. And for each state pair, the state is going to report for all aeroplane operators attributed to that state that conduct operations in that state pair. This is important. So, for example, in the case of state A, who has an aeroplane operator A1 that conducts flights between states A and B, if there are operators from other states also conducted flights in that state pair, only operator A1 will be the one that will be reporting to state A. State A will not have to, let's say, worry about operators from other states operating that state pair because they will report to other states. It is also important that to see that in the reporting of states to ICAO, for a given state pair, there is no operator-specific data on CO2 emissions. Those operators attributed to the state that operate that state pair, all the CO2 emissions from their flights are going to be brought together. And as I said, for a given state pair, emissions from operators not attributed to the state will not be taken into consideration by the state. From 2021, the situation changes slightly when it comes to the reporting from states to ICAO, because on the one hand, they need to report on the total annual CO2 emissions per state pair, aggregated for all aeroplane operators, attributed to the state, but they will also have to provide two subtotals, one related to state pairs not subject to offsetting requirements, and another subtotal related to state pairs subject to offsetting requirements. As we know, this distinction does not apply for the 2019-2020 period. And then the state will also have to provide ICAO information on the total annual CO2 emissions for each operator attributed to the state. And this will be one value per operator. It will not be disaggregated by state pairs. Of course, when operators have used CERT to report to the state, then in the state report to ICAO, this will also be specified. In order to conclude the section on the reporting of CO2 emissions, we need to refer to the third reporting line from the state to the operator. This will apply mainly when it comes to the operator's average CO2 emissions for the period 2019-2020. This is a very important piece of information that aeroplane operators will need to take into consideration, especially from 2030, when the calculation of the growth factor introduces an individual operator's component. So obviously this is a one-time reporting action that will be done on 30th September 2021. So before we move to the next section of this presentation, where we are going to elaborate on the provisions on verification of CO2 emissions, as well as data gaps and error corrections, perhaps I will ask for any questions on the first part of the presentation before we move forward, if there's any. If not, we will continue and we can take all questions at the end of the presentation. So let's move on to the next section on verification of CO2 emissions, data gaps, and error corrections. So verification is a very important component of CORSIA. It is a process that will ensure that information is accurate and doesn't have errors prior to the final reporting of that information. And the verification will require the engagement of an independent third party, which is what we call in the SARS the verification body. So, as I said, verification is an essential part of CORSIA, and it applies to several actions. Here on this slide, we see all the instances where verification activities have to be undertaken. In this presentation, we are going to focus on the verification of the amount of CO2 emissions from international flights. This is what we are going to cover in this presentation. In tomorrow's presentation, we are going to see how verification applies to issues related to CORSIA eligible emissions units, more specifically to the purchase of those units, their cancellation, and then the confirmation of their single use for CORSIA purposes. But now, as I said, we are going to cover just the first bullet on this slide. So, a very important basic concept that we need to keep in mind when talking about the verification of CO2 emissions is in which specific reporting line verification will apply. And this slide shows that verification will apply on the reporting line from the operator to the state. So the information that is going to be subject to verification is that of the aeroplane operator's emissions report. So what we are going to do in the next slides is to see how this reporting line that we now depict in a simple way as just one arrow going from the operator to the state, how the verification activities are deployed under this reporting line. So we are going to go through it in a series of steps. In a first step, there is a recommendation for aeroplane operators to conduct an internal pre-verification of its emissions report before engaging a verification body in the verification per se. This is something which, well, makes plenty of sense because the aeroplane operator, of course, will want to conduct some checks of the information contained in the emissions report in order to make sure that the verification of that information is as straightforward as it can be. So this is shown on our diagram with just this red arrow around the operator text box. So as we said, this internal pre-verification is conducted by the aeroplane operator. It is voluntary in nature, and it aims at ensuring that there are no large data gaps or errors in the information contained in the emissions report. Of course, because this is a voluntary action, each operator decides how to conduct this internal pre-verification of its annual emissions report in line with their already existing practices in this regard. In any case, the Environmental Technical Manual, the ETM, for Annex 16, Volume 4, will include guidance on how this internal pre-verification can be conducted. And that will include like a sort of checklist that operators may wish to take as a reference when conducting the internal pre-verification. What happens after this? Then we move to the second step in the verification process, where the operator will engage the accredited verification body in order to verify its annual emissions report. This is actually what many people consider is the verification as such, but as we see in this presentation, the verification covers a broader range of actions. So this is a question that has come up many times on the way to this seminar, and probably will also be subject to questions in this seminar. What is a verification body? How does the aeroplane operator know which verification bodies to engage? Well, what the adopted Annex 16 Volume 4 states is that a verification body will, in order for them to conduct verification services in CORSIA, will need to be accredited by a national accreditation body for an ISO standard 14065-2013, and in addition will need to be accredited for a series of CORSIA-specific requirements that are described in the Appendix 6 of the adopted Annex 16 Volume 4. The other actor in this activity is the national accreditation body responsible for accrediting the verification bodies that can conduct verification services in CORSIA. This national accreditation body will be working in accordance with an ISO IEC 17011 standard. So it is important that to keep in mind that some provisions have been put in place and some actions are planned in order to ensure that aeroplane operators will be presented with enough accredited verification bodies to support the verification activities in CORSIA. So on the one hand, as we have seen in the previous slide, we need to ensure that verification bodies, in addition to being accredited for a given a specific ISO standard, have a knowledge of CORSIA. So ICAO is exploring means to provide targeted training on the CORSIA verification requirements, and that training will be targeting both national accreditation bodies and verification bodies, because both the national accreditation bodies and the verification bodies need to have a clear understanding and a robust knowledge of CORSIA procedures and the verification activities within CORSIA. In addition, it is important to ensure that operators have access to verification bodies accredited for CORSIA. In this regard, it is important to note that Annex 16 Volume 4 allows an operator to work with verification bodies accredited by the national accreditation body of the state to which the operator is attributed, but also of other states. So it provides like a sort of flexibility in order to increase the availability of verification bodies for the operators. It is also important to see that the adopted Annex 16 Volume 4 requests that ICAO compiles and publish on an annual basis a list of verification bodies accredited for CORSIA to facilitate operators' access to these accredited verification bodies. Of course, the source of the information that will be used by ICAO to compile this list will be the information provided by states and their national accreditation bodies. So the next step in the verification of CO2 emissions related data is that once the verification body has undertaken the verification of the emissions report, then that verification body will produce a verification report. And that verification report will be shared with the aeroplane operator. The following step will be that both the aeroplane operator and the verification body will submit a copy of the emissions report and the associated verification report to the state. That is when finally all the work that has been done around the information on the emissions report reaches the state. And this is what we show with this fourth step on this diagram. And there is a fifth and final state, which is that the state is requested to perform what the SARPs call an order of magnitude check of the emissions report. So the state will need, once the state receives the emissions report and the verification report, the state will conduct this order of magnitude check. The objective of this order of magnitude check of the emissions report is to assess the completeness of data reported by the operator based on the state's knowledge of the operator's activities. We have to take into account that we have, let's say, to put ourselves in the best case scenario where the verification, the interaction between the operator and the verification body has led to a verification report which labels the emissions report as satisfactory. In that case, this fifth step, this order of magnitude check by the state should be relatively straightforward. As it happens with the first step that we have described, for the state's order of magnitude check, there is some guidance that is provided in the ETM, in the Environmental Technical Manual for Annex 16, Volume 4. And that will include a checklist. Again, this is guidance. So the state may wish to take this checklist as it is included in the ETM or adjust it to its national circumstances in order to facilitate this order of magnitude check. What we see on the screen is just a small portion of that checklist. The complete checklist will be provided in the ETM, which will be published at the end of this month. So on this screen, we just summarize what the preparatory actions are to ensure that verification activities under CORSIA work properly. From the state side, there is this task of having the national accreditation bodies, once they have been properly trained on CORSIA-related aspects, informing of those verification bodies that meet both the requirements from the relevant ISO standard and the CORSIA-specific requirements. Once the state has that information from the national accreditation body, the state can provide that list to ICAO. What ICAO will do will be to compile the information provided by the different states and publish a consolidated list of accredited verifiers. And then the operators will have this consolidated list of accredited verifiers as a reference in order to identify suitable verification bodies for the verification of their annual emissions report. In order to complete this second part of this presentation, we just want to provide an overview of how the CORSIA SARPs address data gaps in emissions report. We know that gaps in CO2 emissions related data may occur due to several reasons. For example, data feed issues, system failures, non-scheduled operations, etc. So these data gaps can be identified at different stages. For example, when the aeroplane operator is preparing the emissions report, they can, based on their knowledge of their own operations, identify the existence of such data gaps. It could also be the case that those data gaps make it to the emissions report that is submitted to the verification body, and then the verification body may identify such data gaps. Of course, in that case, the verification body will go back to the aeroplane operator and fill or find a way of filling those data gaps before reporting to the states, because otherwise it could be the case that the verification report related to an emissions report has the non-satisfactory assessment. And last but not least, the state, based on its knowledge of the activities undertaken by the aeroplane operators attributed to it, can also identify data gaps when reviewing the aeroplane operator's emissions report. So there are different actions that are recommended in order to address these data gaps. So, for example, the aeroplane operator, before submitting the emissions report for verification, can fill these data gaps, as we have said before. It is important to see that in this regard, the Annex 16 Volume 4 specifies that an aeroplane operator that has identified data gaps can fill those data gaps using the ICAO cert, even if they are not eligible to use the ICAO CORSIA cert and have to use a fuel use monitoring method, but they can use the ICAO CORSIA cert to fill the gap, provided that the gap is not too big. And that too big is identified in the SARPs in two ways. For the 2019-2020 period, the operator will be able to fill data gaps with cert, provided that those gaps are no more than 5% of international flights operated in that year. And in the 2021-2035 period, operators will be able to use the ICAO CORSIA cert to fill the data gaps, provided that that gap is less than 5% of international flights subject to offsetting requirements. If the extent of the data gaps is beyond those thresholds, well, then in that case, the operator will need to inform the state, and state and operator will need to find a way of addressing the gap. In that regard, the SARPs are not as specific as when the data gaps are below the threshold. What can states and ICAO do in order to address these data gaps? Annex 16 Volume 4 says that in the event of an aeroplane operator not providing its annual emissions report in accordance with the timeline as defined in Appendix 1 of Annex 16 Volume 4, then the state will obviously need to engage with the operator and find a way of having that emissions report being submitted. If this is not possible, or this interaction is unsuccessful, then the state, as per the SARPs, has the possibility of estimating the operator's annual CO2 emissions using what the SARPs identify as best available information and tools, for example, the ICAO CORSIA cert. If, on the other hand, the state does not report on annual CO2 emissions in time, ICAO will also have the possibility of filling data gaps because, of course, it is ICAO who, at the end of the day, and we will see that tomorrow, ICAO will have to calculate the sectoral growth factor, and ICAO will need to have the complete information from all states. In the event of a state not providing that information, ICAO will need to resort to its tools in order to estimate the emissions that have not been reported in due time. Last but not least, if a state identifies that an emissions or a report submitted to ICAO contains some sort of error, then the state will report to ICAO on that error and update the reported CO2 emissions information to address this error. So again, we reached the end of the second part where we have covered verification as well as data gaps and error reporting. And before we move towards the third and last part of the presentation, I would like to open the floor in case there were any questions specifically on this section. I see one gentleman over there. The floor is yours.
Okay, yes, thank you. My name is Guido Harling. I prefacing my question again with the fact that I'm a verifier under European ETS. I see a process where the operator reports to ICAO and the verifier reports or creates a parallel report, which is something that at least the European ETS has decided not to do. So I wonder how these two reports, don't you want to have a common opinion? Because it puts additional burden on ICAO then or on the state, on the state to make sure, this order of magnitude check, what is the actual figure? Don't you want to have this problem solved prior at the side of the aircraft operator when the verifier sees the data in the first place?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. It's a very, very good question, and we hope that we can clarify it. Actually, when we look into the reporting from the operators to the state, we are trying to avoid like a sort of independent reporting from the operator side and from the verification body side. That's why the SARPs state that what will be received by the state will be, I don't know whether this is the right word, a package, consisting of the emissions report and the related verification report. And this will be submitted together to the state. There is the application in the sense that the SARPs request both the operator and the verification body to submit both documents. So the state will be receiving 2 copies of the same document, one submitted from the operator, one submitted from the verification body. And it is also stated in the SARPs that the verification report will by no means be submitted to the state without the clearance and agreement of the operator. So we have 2 documents, but we are looking at them as one package that is received by the state. Thank you. There is another question over there.
Hello, my name is Susanna. I'm also a verifier in the EU ETS. I have a question. Will there be a template for the verification report, or is this up to the verifier?
Thank you for your question. We do not contemplate for the time being making a template available for the verification report. What the ETM, the Environmental Technical Manual, will do, will have a dedicated chapter providing guidance on verification activities under CORSIA. And of course, the main audience for that specific chapter are verification bodies. But we do not have a template of the verification report as such. But we have detailed guidance in the ETM.
But it's a very interesting question, by the way. And if as we proceed, if our states see that it would be something beneficial, we could consider something like that. We did not imagine that we needed something. The way we understood that the ISO guidances for that, the verifications as is for now, they already are quite structured, so we thought not to put anything additional to that. But at the end of the day, if what we see as a result is something that's not very homogeneous, maybe there is room for for that. That's the only reason we did not include yet.
May I
Go
just-
ahead. Yes.
may I just, the ISO, of course, regulates the process of verification and what kind of how to do the verification, how to verify the data, but there is no template for a report in
Yes.
this verification in the ISO system itself. So probably it could be a good idea even also for the states to have the information ready for them to read. Because verification reports, I could imagine something from 2-page to 200-page. So probably there could
It's a very interesting question to be considered. I think we note it down. I know there were some discussions at some point. I want to clarify something else? No. I think there is no template to date, but there were some consideration on having a template beforehand.
As we said before, when it comes to the guidance that is provided under the ETM, not only on the issue of verification, but on anything, this is sort of a living document that will be refined and improved, and we will have future versions of the ETM. So in that regard, of course, it is CAPE who is responsible for reviewing this guidance material as well as the annex material itself. So this may well already be something which is under consideration by the group of experts for a future revision of the ETM. There is another question over there.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Pierre Prémard from France. During the presentation, I got the impression that states will give their verifiers to ICAO. ICAO will consolidate the whole list, and then the operator can just pick one and go with it. Yet, in the SOPs, there's a mention that the verification team shall demonstrate knowledge of the national requirements besides what's in the SOPs, meaning that it wouldn't be that immediate that an operator can pick anyone in the list, right?
Thank you for your question. You are right. There are two things here. The SARPs itself, as I said, provide like a sort of flexibility clause in the sense that they do not constrain which verification bodies are accessible for operators. But it is also true that there is a series of requirements that verification bodies need to meet in order to be able to undertake their verification services satisfactorily. And again, the SARPs do not prejudge a specific regulation that a specific state may have related to the verification services and which verification bodies, entities registered under that state can have access to. So the SARPs wanted to be flexible, and that's why that specific clause is in Annex 16, Volume 4, without preempting the specific requirements states may have in this regard. So both sides are right. So there is the possibility, but there is a series of requirements that the verification body will, in any case, have to meet. Thank you. There is another question, though.
This is a very, again, Christian Patrickson from Chile. It's a very, very specific question. Since you have been talking to the ISO and you have been considering ISO standards, are you considering ISO 14064/3 for the verification? That's my first question. And the second question is it possible for a state to choose verifiers not from the country, but foreign verifiers? I ask this question because it may seem very trivial, but in some countries, I mean, it's hard to find verifiers for certain purposes, and this is a very specific purpose. So that's why I'm asking. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question. I will start with the second one. And when the SARPs were drafted and during the review and approval process, this question came up several times, that there is a possibility of a state where there are airplane operators conducting international flights, but there may be no national accreditation body. So, of course, one of the reasons why this flexibility when it comes to the accessibility of verification bodies by the operators, this is one of the reasons why this was done. So that is there, and that is the reason why we believe that ICAO publishing a consolidated list of verification bodies specifying the states where the verification bodies have been accredited is useful for the operators. When it comes to the ISO requirements, on this slide I have gone back in the presentation, we see the ISO standard which serves as the basis for a verification body to perform the verification of emissions reports in CORSIA. There are, I believe, 2 other ISO standards reference in the SARPs for specific issues related to competencies of the verification team, etc. I do not have the specific references in mind, but maybe afterwards I can share that with you. Thank you. There was one more question over there.
Hi. Azim here from AirAsia, based in Malaysia. I have a question. We have gone through our national accreditation body, and we have received a feedback saying that actually for them to accredit a verifier, it will take around 2 years for this process to complete. So looking at the current implementation timeline, we have a little less than 2 years to go through the verification process. So how do we go about this? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. There is one very important thing that we need to take into account here, which is that there are already verification bodies which are accredited under this ISO 14065-2013, because this is not a CORSIA-specific standard. It's a standard related to the reporting and monitoring of greenhouse gases in general, without being sector-specific or CORSIA-specific. So what the CORSIA SARPs add to the requirements in this ISO standard are these CORSIA-specific requirements, which are covered in Appendix 6 of Annex 16, Volume 4. Because those additional CORSIA-specific requirements do not constitute an ISO standard itself, then we expect that national accreditation bodies will be able to not accredit, but to check that the verification bodies actually meet those additional requirements. We are not creating a new ISO standard here. We are adding a layer of CORSIA-specific requirements to the existing ISO standard. And this is something that will have to be addressed in the context of the training program that, as I mentioned before, is being developed with ICAO in cooperation with the International Accreditation Forum, which is targeting both the national accreditation bodies and the verification bodies, because it is important that what we are adding on top of something which is already well known by many verification bodies are these CORSIA-specific requirements. So that training that we are planning will focus on those in order to facilitate the job of the national accreditation bodies and in order to make the verification bodies more easily conversant with CORSIA. I do not see more. There is one more request from the floor, please.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Mariam Blouchi from the UAE General Civil Aviation Authority. I was thinking, being one of those states who's been the testing process for CORSIA package for 6 months, we have avoided to have the verifier during the testing project. But honestly, we had this discussion with the operators. I have today 3 to 4 operators who's doing reporting every year with the different verifiers. And they are international verifiers, they are not local verifier. We don't have a national verifier yet in the state. So if we think about it, it's not an easy process first, and it's very, very expensive process to have an international verifier, which is happening now. I know that they've been reporting this to us as a government, that it's not, because we've been doing the EU ETS for 3 years now, the reporting, almost 3 years. So, 3 years, right? 5? Okay, it's been already 5 years reporting. So every year we have verifiers. We know the names of the verifier. They are international verifier. I've been seeing them coming to my office as well when they do the verification for Emirates or Etihad. So it's a cross-checking with them. It's a 1 day or 2 days verification, but it's very costly. So how can states avoid this burden, especially for those who's gonna be reporting for the first time? They have to select the verifier. It's not just we pick it from the list, we have to pay for it as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your question and your comment. This is actually something that, in order to address it, we need to have in mind what the starting point is. The starting point is that operators all around the world are already engaging with verification bodies for a range of activities other than CORSIA. So there is already a starting point. The starting point can be something we can benefit from because we are not starting from scratch. But of course, that starting point may also have some difficulties or challenges. So I believe that it is a matter of creating capacity or enhancing capacity. It is not something that is going to happen fast. We hope that the training program that we are going to set in place will serve as an incentive, perhaps for verification bodies who are not currently into this type of activity, to perhaps want to engage in it. Maybe they see business opportunity in it. But of course, we also want to attract and to train those verification bodies that are already in place. But we are aware that there are concerns regarding the costs of verification. Maybe Jane wants to add something.
Just to confirm, it's not for the state to pay.
No, of course, it is for the operators. Yeah.
So the burden is not on the state, Marian. Again, guys, you know, we learn lessons. It's nice to have verification being done for the UETS. We are talking about CORSIA. And I don't know how it's done by the UETS, how far, how deep, how detailed, how costly. But the way it was envisaged for CORSIA is not for the state to pay the verifier. The operator does. Most of the operators do have verifiers for many different things. If you are an enterprise and you have shares, you have a verifier for different reasons. You know, it's business. And as Manuel just said, we also have to bear in mind that, you know, there are challenges, there are opportunities. Now, there will be the need for many operators to verify the emissions reports. So, is that an opportunity? Verifying an emissions report for aviation is not so different than verifying an emissions report for, you know, another installation, etc. There are specificities. Let's know the specificities, but it's a verification. If your job is to be a verifier, you're trained to do that. But I will just put some caveats here. You know, if some state have had burdens with the cost of the UETS verification, that's not how the CORSIA operates, and I don't want confusion here on one scheme, another scheme, etc., because that's not helpful, because we can be misled in our discussions here. So there's not burden for the states on cost of verification. And during let's just go one step back. During the discussions that we had about how the state wanted to receive that information from the operators, there was a lot of discussion. Remember my first presentation, the simple thing. So why we are receiving two things on the state. That was some states wanted that. So we trust the operators. It's fine. But they wanted to receive the 2 reports. Report 1 and report 2 are to be the same. If it's not, if something that this report here says that's different from this report here, there's something wrong. And it's just a cross-check, initial cross-check that makes that process very robust. So there are things that are not additional cost, but they make the process very robust. For the state, when they receive that information, they are comfortable. They trust that information. So I just don't want things to be confused with some statements about experiences elsewhere. Experiences elsewhere, they are good if they give you experience to move forward. But it doesn't mean that this is CORSIA experience. And we have to separate a little bit, not to be misled in the discussions. Okay? I'm mindful of the time. You still... You have 10 minutes, by the way.
Okay. Well, the good news is that the third part of the presentation is a very short one, so we can quickly go through it. In this third part, actually, what we wanted to do is to show a summary with a timeline of actions that are related to not only what we have seen in this presentation, but also what we saw in this morning's presentation on monitoring. So what we have done is to provide like a table with a series of dates where you can see who is requested to do what and when they are supposed to do that. So we have to keep into account when looking into this table that of course the effective date of implementation of the SARPs is 1st of January 2019. So any action that is shown before 1st of January 2019 is a recommendation. There is a recommendation for the operators to do this, for the states to do that, etc. But it is not something that can be reflected in the SARPs. So for example, the table says that in order to get ready for the implementation of the monitoring requirements as of 1st of January 2019, it would be recommended that operators already submit their emissions monitoring plan to their state by end of September of this year. And that would allow the states to review and eventually approve the emissions monitoring plans by end of November. We would also request states to submit to ICAO the list of operators attributed to the states so that ICAO at the end of this year can already make available this document linking the aeroplane operators to the respective states. From 1st of January 2019, all the entries that we see in this table are actually taken from Annex 16, Volume 4. So, of course, as we have seen already a few times today, from 1st of January 2019, operators will start monitoring the CO2 emissions from international flights. If the recommendation to submit their emissions monitoring plan in 2018 could not be accomplished, then the SARPs say that operators have until end of February of 2019 to submit their emissions monitoring plan. And the state has 2 months to review and eventually approve the emissions monitoring plan of the operators attributed to it. By end of April of 2019, the SARPs also request states to submit to ICAO, on the one hand, an updated list of operators attributed to the state, and on the other hand, a list of verification bodies accredited in the state, if there is any, at the time of this action. And then ICAO will make available the consolidated list of operators and the respective state of attribution. If we move forward into MRV-related actions in 2020, we see that, of course, 1st of January, operators will start the monitoring of the CO2 emissions for that year, CO2 emissions from international flights, and we see how the SARPs establish a clear sequence of actions for the operator to produce the emissions report, to engage the verification bodies for them to conduct the verification of the emissions report, then to submit this information to the states, and so forth and so on. So these two slides that we have on these presentations have just extracted a series of entries that you will find in the very detailed Appendix 1 of the adopted Annex 16, Volume 4, where you have a very detailed sequence of actions to be undertaken by operators and states. So with this, we conclude the presentation. As I have opened the floor for questions in the two previous parts, I will do it once again in case there is any other question you may want to ask on this subject. After which, I would like to quickly go through the template of the emissions report in the same way as we went through the template of the emissions monitoring plan. I see a request from the floor over there. Please.
Thank you for the presentation. Rashid Rahim from Qatar Civil Aviation Authority. I go back to the previous question regarding the verifiers and the accreditation bodies. You mentioned there will be training programs for these two entities. My question is, the verifiers and accreditation bodies that will attend these training programs will be selected in consultation with the member states, or it's open to any verifier or accreditation bodies, taking into account that the states will submit the list of the accreditation bodies and the verifiers? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Regarding the training program that is being planned by ICAO in cooperation with IAF, that training program will target both national accreditation bodies and verification bodies. In that regard, we want to be as inclusive as possible and reach as many relevant stakeholders as possible. In order to do that, we believe that an important action from our side will be to inform our member states of this training being set in place, and of course encourage them to invite their national accreditation bodies and any verification body operating in the state to attend this training. Of course, we are aware of the difference between the national accreditation bodies, which are much more limited in number and are much more linked to the states, and the verification bodies, which are private entities. But we will try to be as inclusive as possible in our outreach. Thank you. I see no more requests from the floor, so I think that we can move to the very last part of this first day of the seminar, where we just wanted to share with you the template of the emissions report. As we have said this morning, not this morning, after the lunch break, these templates that we are sharing with you are not the final versions that will be posted in the ICAO CORSIA website. This is work in progress. As you know, the adoption of the annex took place last week. There are a few things that have to be fixed, but this looks very similar to what the final templates will be. We also want to remind you that the templates are guidance material, which is provided for operators and states in order to facilitate the preparation of the emissions monitoring plan and the emissions report. But it is not something that has to be followed from A to Z. An operator, or better said, the state, may want to take these templates and adapt it based on specific national circumstances. So what we have here is a generic template that we hope serves as guidance. So we will quickly go through the different tabs. We have, first of all, like basically the content of the emissions report. Then we have the tab where we have the information related to the operator submitting the emissions report, and we have filled some of the fields of this emissions report in line with what we did for the emissions monitoring plan. So we have the identification items, name of the operator, address, contact person or persons, legal representative. Then we have information on the procedure that the operator follows to attribute airplanes to the operator as per information in item 7 of the flight plan. So in line with what we saw for the sample of the emissions monitoring plan, this specific operator uses the ICAO designator as defined in ICAO document 8585. Then, we see the detail of what the ICAO designator is in this case. And then we have the information that the operator will provide regarding the verification body that has verified this emissions report. Then we have a tab which refers to information specific on the emissions monitoring plan. As we said, the emissions report is a document that is prepared taking as a reference the framework provided by the emissions monitoring plan. So it is very important that both the operator and the state have a common understanding of what the version of the emissions monitoring plan is the one that has been used as the basis for preparing the emissions report. So this tab compiles all this information related to the emissions monitoring plan. The next tab on aeroplane fleet and fuel just provides a table where the operator will include the different types of aeroplane and will include the information related to registration marks and details on ownership, as well as the type of fuel used by type of aeroplane. And here, of course, we have a table with a number of entries. If more entries were required, then of course the operator could append more pages with a similar table to the template. There is also a tab specifically on fuel density, where the operator will specify whether the standard fuel density or the actual density was used to determine the fuel uplift during the reporting year. And then after these tabs, we move into the reporting tabs per se. Here, first of all, it is specified whether the data will be reported aggregated by state pair or by aerodrome pair. As we said, this is something that the state has to inform the operators so that they are aware of it by the time they start the reporting. And then the template that will be shared has two tabs. One for the event when the reporting is made based on state pairs, and one tab where the reporting to be used when the reporting will be made by aerodrome pairs. So we can quickly go, for example, to the one on state pairs, and we see that here the information has been partially filled, taking into account the example that was provided in the previous presentation on CERT, so the figures will be familiar to you, and the information items that are included are in line with what we have seen in the presentation that we have just gone through. So the operator will have to report on the total CO2 emissions from the international flights. Of course, because we are reporting for 2019 data, it is not relevant or not applicable to report on CO2 emissions from flights subject to offsetting requirements. The total number of international flights that are covered during the reporting period also have to be specified here. There will need to be a table specifying the amounts of fuel used by fuel type. Then there will be this additional information that we mentioned during the presentation in the event of the operator claiming emissions reductions from CORSIA eligible fuels. This, of course, is not that pertinent for the 2019-2020 periods, but it is already included in the templates so operators have an idea of what are the information requests in this event. Also a reminder that for claiming emission reductions from CORSIA eligible fuels, in addition to the information that will be incorporated in this template or on the report template that the state will want to use as the basis, there will be additional supplementary information that will have to be reported separately. You will find those in Appendix 5 of Annex 16, Volume 4, and we have a summary of that in the presentation we have just gone through. Then we have the table with all state pairs that have been operated during the reporting year. And again, these state pairs will be familiar to you because I believe are the ones that have been used during the third practical example. And again, we have a limited number of rows here that can be complemented with additional pages. Similar let's say, approach is followed when reporting on aerodrome pairs. Of course, the first tables are the same. They do not change depending on the level of aggregation. What changes, of course, is the last table because here we will have to specify as many entries as aerodrome pairs the operator has, which in principle should be more than the entries in the event of reporting on a state pair basis. And to conclude this quick overview of the emissions report template, we have a specific tab on data gaps where the operator will be requested to provide some information on, first of all, whether data gaps were identified or not during the reporting year, and if so, what were the procedures put in place by the operator in order to address those data gaps. Again, as I said, the templates for both the emissions monitoring plan and the emissions report, the final versions will be uploaded in the ICAO CORSIA website in the end of July, in parallel to the release of the Environment Technical Manual for Annex 16, Volume 4. And with this, we conclude this overview of the emissions report template. Unless there is any question from the floor, then I will pass the floor to Jane.
So, do we have questions? Okay, I want you to take just 1 second and think about where we were before we started today, the explanations on CORSIA, where we are now. A lot of information, a lot to digest, a lot to think about today. There is much more information tomorrow. So I think we all deserve a nice evening now, right? So let me tell something about tomorrow. We will start tomorrow. We'll do a very quick recap, and then we have a full day. There was a lot of questions today about capacity building, assistance, training. Tomorrow in the afternoon, we are going to go and explain all of that. And we also will have states that will come here. I have 10 states coming here tomorrow afternoon to express their support for the capacity building. You will be really looking into that. So, on that note, as you have seen in the program tonight, we are doing something very important. So I have my director with me, and he would like to address a few words to you. We are really launching a very important program on assistance, capacity building, and training. So on that note, Boubacar, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, all. Officially, we have the lunch at 5:30 with the reception, but because of a small practical issue, we will prefer addressing that issue official opening now, and then we will move directly to the drinks, to the informal, cordial atmosphere in which we should always be. So on behalf of the Secretary General, who unfortunately cannot be with us here, we wish to thank you for being here, and in particular, the distinguished council members, the state representatives, and all the participants here coming from the industry, coming from the relevant stakeholders in all the member states. It's really exciting times, as you know. Since Friday officially, we know that we are moving forward, we are moving ahead, we are moving in the right direction. So we want to be sure that in the spirit of the UN, in the spirit of ICAO, in the spirit of what we call no country left behind, that all states with aeroplane operators that perform international flight can fulfill the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirement of CORSIA. You've heard those concepts, those issues in the regional seminar this morning, this afternoon, but now we want to be officially able to report to you, to tell you that we want to move ahead in officially launch what we call the ICAO Act CORSIA program. It's a comprehensive program to provide assistance, capacity building, and training. And we are fortunate then to be able to put it under a positive action that we call ACT. On CORSIA for all states with aeroplane operators that perform international flights. It's important. We need to be sure that any UN state, any ICAO state, any state in need can receive and be provided the required and appropriate assistance. So this program is designed to harmonize and bring together all relevant actions promoting coherence to capacity building efforts. So we would like really to be able to understand, to anticipate, to format, and of course to make it the best possible in the interest of time, of money spent, and of course, if possible, in all the ICAO languages. It's very important that everybody, if possible, will be available to receive the assistance in the relevant language. Of course, we cannot hide that we will have challenges, and this is why, in particular, we appeal to other states being able to provide assistance to join us. It's a common effort, and we want everybody to be comfortable, to understand, and to implement. So we have, of course, we have what is very important for us, the body partnership. The President of the Council addressed that issue in his speech this morning. Through those partnerships, we want to be sure that states can help other states that may not have either the capacity, either the technical means. Secondly, the training of national aviation experts on the MRV provisions of CORSIA and the relevant tools of its implementation. Of course, from those national aviation experts, they will be able to be in touch with the other relevant experts of the state of the region. It's important, but our mandate is to begin by the aviation one, and this is why we kindly ask you to be with us today. We want also to be able to direct assistance to states through, for example, a sample regulatory frameworks to help them prepare their national legislation for the implementation of the scheme. Here also, of course, we are fully aware of the possible regional arrangement with the framework of existing bodies or in ad hoc agreement that the regions can wish to implement specifically because of CORSIA. We want also to put on the website of everywhere what we call the frequently asked question, which will be accessible to everybody on the CORSIA website, in addition to the informal direct interaction that you can have with the expert of the Secretariat who are here, and of course the others who are not present with us today. We want also to be able to provide training videos and online tutorials to allow interested experts to get a full picture. That one, of course, address in general the young people. We know the difference, how they can be very familiar with internet, with all those tools that can really facilitate the understanding. Brochures and leaflets also, you receive them. Some of them are still outside. You receive them through the regional seminars. We will continue to provide on this appropriate format the high-level information to be used for awareness purposes and for the development of training material. it's important. We took a mandate. We have received instruction from the Council. No new standards before capacity building impact assessment guidelines. So it's clear that here we are to implement those instructions. We will not move if you are not convinced, if you don't know how to implement, and if you know how to implement with the appropriate equipment. And of course, ICAO is a regulatory body to have the appropriate regulatory framework. So it's not just another acronym. And when you check on internet and in the English dictionary, the definition of ACT, you have several proposals. For me, the most relevant is the one which say that ACT means to take effect, to have a particular effect. For me, here we are asking you to have a specific effect. Experts have worked. We need to thank them. This is why we are here today. Secretariat has done their part of the job. Council did it on Friday, so now we are going back to you. Please assist us in implementing, in reaching the goals of the UN on the Sustainable Development Goals. As individuals, each of us knows on an individual way what means the impact of climate change, and now in a more structured way to be sure that our sector, the international aviation, will be able to continue to sustain the development of the state, but in taking into account what we call CORSIA. And of course, CORSIA, the R of reduction, I think it's one of the most important concepts. It's in between when you look at the acronym. It's maybe difficult to implement, but this is why we are here with you. We want to act, so, and thank you. We are here to act. Thanks.
Okay. So today is the official launching of ACT CORSIA. Tomorrow we are giving you very specific details on how to, so you will understand how to have 192 states trained in 6 months to be able to start CORSIA on 1st January 2019, how we are going to have all the operators trained to have CORSIA starting on 1st January 2019, all the things we have to do still this year for all of that to happen. So the how-to will be explained to you tomorrow. But it's a very interesting strategy that we have put together with our member states and with the airlines, and we have a very good plan, but will be unveiled tomorrow. But today, we have now to celebrate. CORSIA is on, and we have many nice victories today as well to celebrate during our reception. So you're all invited. The food and drinks are outside, and we would like to thank IATA, ACI, and Thales for supporting us for this very nice evening. Thank you, and enjoy your evening.